Welcome to NEMO's last webinar in 2018. I'm very glad to see that so many people joined. My name is Fabienne and I'm working as Operations Manager for the Network of European Museum Organizations, NEMO. NEMO connects national museums associations as well as individual museums and interest groups from more than 40 countries. Being an ever-growing network, so far we count over 90 members. NEMO represents over 30,000 museums across Europe towards policymakers on national and EU level. Furthermore, we share knowledge and train museum professionals through learning exchanges, training courses, and our webinars. Usually we host 3 to 4 webinars per year, facilitated by different museum professionals in Europe about diverse topics in the museum field. Today, Jenny Siung, Head of Education in the Chester Beatty Library, Dublin, will talk about how museum professionals can collaborate with local creative partners and makers. In this webinar, you will find out how your museum can address creative collaborations in the design and delivery of programs for existing and new audiences. You will also learn how these collaborations can support the interpretation of museum objects in a creative, experimental way, while developing new skills for museum staff. The Chester Beatty Library opened its doors 2 times for creators to work with their collection, and we are very excited to hear about their experiences. You can ask questions during the webinar through the chat, and we will forward them to our speaker. Soon after the webinar, you will find the video on NEMO's YouTube channel, where you can also watch previous NEMO webinars. As we are having our annual conference soon from 15 till 18 of November 2018, I would like to invite you to join us for the conference in Valletta, Malta, and register at our website. Here is a little teaser video, after which I will give the word to Jenny Siung.
Thank you, Fabienne, and thank you to NEMO for this opportunity to, I suppose, share the practice of both the Chester Beatty, but also with my creative partners through the Creative Museum, which is now the Making Museum. And this really is to highlight, I suppose, the way I've been working over the last 4 or 5 years as a museum professional in the education sense, but also as somebody who thought they knew their craft and suddenly discovered, especially at the end of the boom here in Ireland and during the recession, that I needed to upskill my own person within the context of learning and engaging with our audiences, but also creative collaborations. So in a nutshell, I work in a museum and art library which is based in the city centre of Dublin. And to give you an idea of the collection itself, it was collected by a gentleman called Sir Alfred Chester Beatty. He was a mining engineer, and He himself was born in 1875 in the United States, and as a young man he was, I suppose, swept up in that whole frenzy of mining at the time. He was born in New York, and then he relocated to Denver, Colorado, where he built up his own profession as a mining engineer, but he also physically developed silicosis, so he got out of the mining itself and he developed his own business dealing with minerals. And as part of, I suppose, his recovery from silicosis, which is a typical mining disease of the lungs, he was advised by his doctors to go to drier, warmer climates. And this is where he encountered North Africa, and he bought a house in Cairo. And there he started collecting early biblical papyrus, but he was a collector of stamps and a collector of minerals from a very young age. And then over time, with his business and his acumen and his good eye, he started collecting manuscripts, rare manuscripts, unlike, I suppose, his peers, the Getty family, for example, who were collecting those wonderful paintings of the great masters. He was an astute businessman, and he looked out for good purchase of materials to add to his own private collection of manuscripts. And his travels took him as far as Japan in around 1918, and he was traveled through China as well. And this is where he started collecting his own private library. And then, I suppose, during World War II, he was based in London, and he had a house called Baroda House, not too far from Kensington. And he was a very good friend of Winston Churchill. He himself would have assisted in the war effort of contributing to the minerals, I suppose, the making of bombs and so on, which I suppose is a negative thing. But he himself would have been recognized for his war efforts. And they gave their house over to the American wounded soldiers during World War II as well. He was knighted for his efforts. And as soon as Winston Churchill fell from power, he decided to move his collection elsewhere because he found the duties that were being imposed on what he was bringing into the country as part of his private collection, the duties were too high. And again, being an astute businessman, he decided to move elsewhere. And this is where Ireland became a point of interest for him because he had Irish Scottish ancestry. And in 1950, he moved over to Dublin. And 1950 Dublin was not the most enticing city post-World War II, but he found himself in the salubrious suburbs of Dublin itself called Shrewsbury Road, is where he developed his own private library, and he lived around the corner. And he made an effort to try and entice Irish people to come to see this unusual collection. And at that time, Ireland was very much a Roman Catholic country. It had gained independence in 1922, but it was a British colonial country. And he decided, rather than looking at these Qur'ans or these are a few examples of our collections on display here, he decided to buy Christian material to try and gain the interest of the Irish population. So the library was there until 1999, but he himself died in 1968, and he left his collection to a board of trustees on the basis that the government would support it financially every year. So from 1969 until 1999, it was based in the suburbs of Dublin. And occasionally we might have had one visitor a day. It was very, very low profile, but of huge interest to scholars. And then, I suppose, with the Renaissance, there was a cultural renaissance in Ireland, and it runs in parallel with the economic boom known as the Celtic Tiger from 1997 till 2007, 2008, with the great crash of the 21st century. And our very first Minister for Culture helped the library find a new location, and we are now here in the city centre of Dublin. And it coincided both with the economic boom, but also with returning Irish migrants, but also new migrants into the country of Ireland, which for the first time in our history, we started seeing people from all over the world come to Ireland. And again, I started in January of 2000, it made a lot of sense for us to engage with the communities as represented in the collections. And so I've started the first intercultural education program in an Irish museum. But I suppose over time, when exploring how best to engage this incredibly beautiful Islamic, East Asian and European collection, how does one engage a collection like this with predominantly Irish audiences, because the subjects are not entirely reflected in our curriculum. It's not reflected entirely in our national identity, and it's not really reflected in how we view ourselves as being Irish. But there are new Irish identities that have emerged over the boom, and these are the new communities who can find themselves in these collections, but also they can share these conversations with our existing audiences as well. And so I suppose from 2000 until the present day, we've been offering that traditional offer in museums of guided tours, workshops, family programs, workshops for children, workshops for teenagers, and so on and so forth. But when the crash occurred here in 2007, our money disappeared overnight, and that's for the entire country and right across Europe. But we still were expected to continue on with our public service, because this is a gift for the nation, it's a gift for us to share and to impart its knowledge with our local audiences. And I was also part of a European project called the Learning Museum. And the Learning Museum was funded under what used to be called Grundvik. And it was a 3-year learning partnership looking at how museums can foster learning in all different contexts, including, I suppose, working with older people, working with communities, and so on and so forth. And some of the partners I had developed a conversation with, including Cap Science in Bordeaux and partner from our partners in Italy and so on. We said, well, how are we going to continue this conversation? How are we going to maintain this opportunity for us as museum professionals to explore different learning contexts? We're kind of stuck, we're kind of pushed to one side insofar as we have very little money, but yet we all have this potential to extend our learning experiences both for ourselves and for our audiences. And there was a speaker from the Denver Art Museum, Colorado, who gave a webinar at the final conference for the Learning Museum. And she introduced this whole concept of audiences engaging in the spaces of the museum, in shared spaces where they learn from each other. And I was very struck by that idea, and I said, well, why don't we, as museum professionals, not only upskill ourselves, but also offer an opportunity for working with creative collaborators outside of the museum sector. And hence was born the Creative Museum. And we kickstarted in 2014, and we ended in 2017, and we got another 18 months called the Making Museum to continue this dialogue, how museum professionals can learn from each other, particularly in the sector called the making, or the maker community. And a maker, I don't know if people know what makers are. I take it for granted now. A maker is somebody who is into do-it-yourself, DIY, who spends time tinkering, exploring, taking things apart, is into soldering, electronics, design, but also the traditional crafts, knitting, sewing, printing, creating. It's all about using hands and also sharing these ideas. We call it open source. So the maker community, the beauty about the maker community is that they don't keep these ideas to themselves. They share. They share very openly and freely. And so much so that this started in the Bay Area in San Francisco in around 2008, which is at the height of the crash. And that maker community has moved. It's a global phenomenon. The most recent maker event was in Rome this month in October. And Dublin itself has Dublin Maker every July. So I'm sure for most of the participants here, they have a local making community they may know or may not know. But for us as a traditional Irish museum, we decided to look at our own local community and see how we could join forces with our local maker community. But also as part of the Creative Museum project, there was a platform for a number of the project partners to engage with makers and invite them from the other partners' country into the host's museum and offer a platform for a young maker, so to give them an opportunity to try something out, use their skill, but engage and collaborate with the museum. So for us, for the very first time, we hosted a creative technologist. And I never heard of the term a creative technologist until we met Chris, who was based in Finland. One of our partners is the Finnish Museums Association. And Chris was completing his MA in creative technology, and he was looking very specifically at how to build a small computer which is called a Raspberry Pi. And again, these are all terms that were not very familiar with me and for a lot of my partners. And a Raspberry Pi for him cost €40 to make. So that gives you an idea of the power of working with makers, is that it is possible to create something on a tight budget, but it's still as powerful and immediate as, let's say, your fancy iPad or Apple computer, which costs a lot more than that. But Chris came over to Dublin and he looked at our online digital collections, and he spoke to the curator and the head of collections and the museum and looked at how he could interpret the collections and map them out. You can see in the upper side there, I don't know if you can see that up here. This is the atrium, this is the public space. There's a cafe here, a shop, toilets, and the galleries are up here. He looked at the wall and he specifically mapped out a series of images from the Islamic, East Asian, and European collections, and he rotated them in this program and projected on the wall there. For us, this was the first time we allowed somebody from the outside to come in and harness creative technology, such as the Raspberry Pi and a projector, and use the collections in a very unique way for us, and map the images onto the wall for the public to see. But also his legacy when he was here in Dublin was he worked with our audiences, he engaged with our teens, and he engaged with our adults, and he introduced them to projection mapping as well. So this was a unique learning experience for the Chester Beatty, but also for Chris, because he learned the ins and outs of what it's like to work in a museum. The museum traditionally we open from 10 o'clock to the public during the week, and we close at 5. Makers don't necessarily work those hours. So one of our festival partners, the Festival of Curiosity, they're our annual science festival, offered Chris a space after hours for him to continue his work. And they're based in a space called the Chocolate Factory. So they gave him space for free, which was absolutely fantastic because the budgets were tight. But we also introduced Chris to our local maker community, including TOG, which is the one and only hackerspace that I know of, but we also collaborate with TOG Dublin Hackerspace, and he introduced projection mapping to local Irish makers. And he met another one in Trinity College who curated the maker program out in a library in the suburbs of Dublin. So we didn't just keep to ourselves, we wanted to share the experience of working with a European maker with our local Irish partners. And again, I suppose the power of social media. Makers communicate on Twitter, and that's a platform that I became familiar with as well. I kind of sound like I work in the dark ages, but I thought I knew my craft, and I suppose working with a local maker and working with a European maker, it was important to share the news about his work with our local maker community and our local museum community. And these are just a few examples. And just to showcase, like this is somebody who's come over specifically to work with collections and projection mapping. Projection mapping, I think, is very popular in other European countries, including Berlin and in Latvia. But in Ireland, projection mapping is incredibly expensive, and a projector can cost up to €100,000. And when I went looking for the projector for Chris before he came over, it was just before Christmas. A lot of people were hiring projectors for big Christmas parties or big projects. And I think there are 10 projectors of this high level, very, very high powered. It's an ASNI projector. And they all laughed at me on the phone saying, you know, you must be joking. There are no projectors available at this moment because it's coming up to Christmas. Whereas Chris, he's very familiar with these projectors. They're very easily accessible where he's from. He's from Latvia, but he was based in Finland, and he also collaborates with makers in Berlin. And projectors are very easily come by in those countries. So for us, it was a huge learning curve, but also for us to be able to engage with our local networks. Our head of security spoke to somebody in the castle here, and they discovered they have the very projector that we needed, and they very kindly lent it to us for a much smaller amount of funding. So we managed to push this through, Otherwise, we would have had to have, I suppose, changed the project ever so slightly to suit the environment. I.e., we didn't have enough money, but we could elaborate and look at projection mapping in a different way. So that's the 20K ANSI, that's what it's called. And that's basically, I think it's the first Irish museum to work with a creative technologist and to open it to the public. Other institutions such as Trinity College, which is our university based in the city centre, they've done projection mapping. But for an Irish museum to afford a projector like this, we just don't have the funds to do that. So we have to look at creative alternative ways. And this is opening up the space in a very unusual way for Irish museums. And I was just really pushing the promotion of Chris, the Chester Beatty, the Creative Museum, and the projection mapping itself. I'm going to play you a short video, if that's okay. Oops, it's the wrong one.
So the idea behind the installation is very simple. So it's to come into the museum, explore its collections, and then make something from the collections. So in this case, it's the collection of the Chester Beatty Library, and I'm building a database out of the artifacts that is stored in this collection, and building a data-driven application on top of it, which is then projection mapped on the wall. I think the interesting part was actually exploring the collections and looking at the images, because I always underestimated the value of the artifacts that are stored in museums, and after this experience I value these kind of things more.
The Chester Beatty Library is one of the coordinators of this EU-funded project under Erasmus+, and the project isn't called the Creative Museum Project. And it's funded for 3 years, and it's a vocational training in education project. The Creative Museum Project has offered opportunities for both museums and makers to explore new ways in interpreting collections.
So for me, every next project is a kind of experiment and a challenge. This time the challenge was to explore whether I can do something interesting with the collection, and also to test whether my software that runs on the Raspberry Pi, whether it is fit for this kind of work, because we are using a 20K projector driven by a single Raspberry Pi computer, and it looks amazing. Museums open the doors for makers and explain the constraints, or open up the constraints and present these constraints to the maker, and then the maker would operate in these bigger territory and experiment with the content of the museum and create something new.
I think it's very important for us to have opportunities to meet and talk. I think it's important for us to look at the skill set that we bring to each other. I think it's very important that we all come from equal fields. We co-curate, we co-discuss, and then we come about to what is possible and what is not possible.
So one thing that people could take away, I think that museums are open spaces where one can and should come in.
So I would like maybe students to explore them for this school projects, makers to explore them for their projection mapping, other museum staff to look maybe at objects. I want people to remember that this is a public institution, that we are open and we are eager to meet others.
A way of creating access for both the museum and the maker to look at spaces, to look at collections, to engage with audiences, as well as invite and encourage makers who are in our communities right across the world, and invite them to co-creating and reinterpret collections in really interactive and new ways. That video gives you an idea of the experience of both Chris, the maker, and Chester Beatty, the museum, the art library. And as you can see, it was a really good combination of two parties who were willing to meet halfway and open up to the idea of sharing, co-creating and sharing a collection that in most traditional museums belongs to the curator. But on this part, there was a generosity on the part of the museum, but also generosity of Chris, who shared his learning experience from his MA, which was building that Raspberry Pi, and then building that program and projecting it on a space. And it was the first time that the Chester Beatty decided to open up its mind and its doors to a non-museum person, and still create this powerful piece of work. I'll call it an artwork for people to experience and share and explore. The story doesn't stop here, though, because with the Creative Museum itself, we have brought making to the bigger world of other museum professionals. And through one of our partners, Vish Stam, Jasper Visser, who's one of our consultants in the Creative Museum, he is also an MC for the Museum Next program, that annual, they're on once or twice a year, and they move around the world and they look at museums in all different contexts. And it came to Dublin in 2016. And because of that creative partnership through the Creative Museum, Jasper said, do you mind, do you think we could have a fringe event in the Chester Beatty? And again, for us, it's like, whoa, wow, this is a really amazing, event called the Museum Next. We'll never ever get them to find us or to get their attention. But the fact of the matter was, we were able to host a fringe event during the big conference itself. And one of our other partners, Heritech in Education, Joanne Sunderland, looked at the very simple geometric patterns of Islamic design, and that's reflected in our collections, and got all the participants to create these stars based on and inspired by Islamic geometric patterns, and everyone participated. We also invited other members of our maker community, including Tog, and participants worked in teams and they built bridges out of lollipop sticks, and the challenge was to build the bridge and then smash it up into pieces. Or we had somebody from the Science Gallery Dublin talk about their experience, and so on and so forth. So we opened up that platform not only for the museum itself, but for other local makers to share their own experiences with the wider world of museums. So much so that the Chester Beatty has more confidence working with makers, but also I have more confidence trying things out rather than doing there's nothing wrong with the traditional way of practice in museum education. I'm not saying that I'm not negating it. It's a very powerful way of opening up museums to audiences. But I decided to dip my toe into a hackathon, which is a 2-day event, and it was held out in Tog, that Dublin makerspace I mentioned, and they participate in Science Hack Day. It's a local makerspace, and I, for the first time, worked with a team of coders, makers, engineers, designers, and we made our own floating Japanese lamp. And there were 2 lights, or LED lights, in the lamp, the floating lamp. And if it hit hot water, the light turned red, and if it hit cold water, the light went blue. So that was a collaborative, creative effort. And those are the trophies for Science Hack Day. I won my first hackathon trophy. So, it's a positive experience. So much so, again, that confidence continues. We were approached by a maker from the United States in 2016, and they were looking for a place to work with through the San Jose twinning, which is a twinning between Dublin and San Jose and San Francisco. There's a program of exchange, and this maker wanted to create Japanese friendship knots. She was looking at Celtic design and Japanese design. And the fact of the matter is, we have a Japanese collection, and we just so happened to have an exhibition that was celebrating the diplomatic relations between Japan and Ireland. And we said, yeah, hell yeah, we'd love to have you over and work with our teenagers and our audiences with this concept that you have. Now, I'm going to, there's a question here from Ellery Evans. What role do the curators play in the projection mapping project? The curators at the time, I think we had 2 curators and 1 head of collections. And it was really the head of collections who opened up the opportunity for the projection mapper or the creative technologist to access the collections. So access was the most important part, and the curators helped pull out the best of the best objects in the collection, and they put it on a data. We have a digitized collection, and they offered him the opportunity to see the images online. Now, Eleni Vasilaki, innovation, creativity, purpose, so beautiful endeavor, and powerful meaning. Was it easy for participants to cooperate? For most, because projection mapping is a new idea, it's a new term that's used in Ireland. And again, you know, I said it's really wrapped up with a lot of the bigger companies who can afford projection mapping. It's not cheap, but with a maker like Chris, the creative technologist, they've made it far more accessible for the likes of our museum and for our local makers and our local audiences to try it out. And I think if it's made accessible, then it's a lot easier to get cooperation. And the proof is in the pudding. You saw the beautiful projection mapping in the atrium. So if you can show people, and that's the power of documenting these endeavors, is that you can showcase it and you can share and you can talk about it. Would I do it again? Absolutely. And that's, I'm just showing you that we've got a steady flow of makers coming into the museum and working with us because we've had such a positive experience. Corinne Okada Takara, she's Japanese, Irish, Hawaiian, and she came over in 2017 for 2 weeks, and she worked with us. She worked with our teenagers. She worked with the collections. But she also worked with the Festival of Curiosity and Dublin Maker, which is the ancillary to the making community. And she spent a whole day at the end of her busy week here and sharing her love of Celtic and Japanese knots with I think over 1,000 people who came to Dublin Maker that Saturday. So we love working with makers. That's the thing. They bring in a new element and fresh perspective to collections. Training is really important. And through, I suppose, us gathering confidence in collaborating and looking at new ways of engaging with our audiences and working with makers, we applied for a technology or equipment grant through a funder called the City of Dublin Youth Service Board, and they fund our Teen Lab program. It's our monthly program for teens aged 12 to 17, and we, again, I use that term, we dipped our toe and bought a 3D printer. We were so excited. But before we, you know, let this 3D printer loose to the teens, we ourselves need to understand how to use it. And this is an engineer and a 3D printer who we got to know through TOG, our local hackerspace. Colin Keogh is his name. And he came in, he trained our facilitators and our education team. We opened it up to other members of staff to learn how best to use a 3D printer. And this Friday, for example, our teens are coming in to do a workshop with Colin to learn the art of 3D printing inspired by the collection. So they're going to work with one of our curators and our 3D printer, Colin Keogh, the guy here on the left. So they're going to learn how to curate an exhibition and then respond to it by creating their own designs using a 3D printer. And so much so, again, I've started to think outside the box. I thought I did think outside the box, but obviously I didn't, not within the context of working with makers. Again, our steady partnership with the Science Festival, Festival of Curiosity, they asked, would we like to host an intergenerational family workshop with somebody from the National Geographic? And it's a biodigester workshop. I said, what is a biodigester? Well, a biodigester is a container where you can throw away all your biodegradable kitchen trash and your toilet trash into this container, mix it with compound, and it creates gas. I was like, well, what's this got to do with the Chester Beatty? Well, Chester Beatty was a mining engineer. He was interested in earth science. And this is just another example of how to think outside the box again. So this gentleman from the National Geographic happened to be over in Dublin as part of their festival, TJ Cohan, and he created this biodigester workshop for families on a roof garden. It's not suitable inside because the materials might kick off the fire alarm. So we held it on a roof garden, and as you can see, they worked very, very hard to create these biodigesters in July. And again, we wanted to extend this training not just for our facilitators and for our audiences, but we want to share the whole idea of working with makers with our local professionals. And in March of this year, we worked with one of our consultants from the Creative Museum called Don Undine. He set up the Georgetown Maker Hub in the United States. He was over in March, and he worked again with TOG, with ourselves and the Festival of Curiosity. And we had a host of 17 local Irish-based museums and makers, and they worked together in teams. They were given these cards using their phones and their camera phones. They were given a concept. So this is an example of spaceship for first contact with a distant alien society. What has that got to do with the museum? Well, they had to think about this whole concept, and they had to take photographs of the objects. It was the first time in March that people were allowed to take photographs of objects. Up until then, we were not allowed to take photographs with camera phones. So it's about creating spaces for to give people permission to be creative without feeling that they're not allowed, do things like take photographs in the museum. And then collectively, they take the different parts of their idea and put them together to make this concept. I can't remember exactly what they used to create the spaceship for first contact with a distant alien society. But if you look at hashtag CBL Make the Museum, you're going to come across a good few ideas on that particular handle. But it's introducing design thinking using objects from the collection. And design thinking, again, is a concept of bringing design and thinking together and opening up this space for people to be creative in very innovative ways. They had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. We actually do have a film, YouTube film on YouTube, and that's available. You can check the Chester Beatty website and go to our YouTube channel, and you'll see the film there. Again, we like work with makers so much that we had our second maker in residence this summer, and we worked with two local Irish-based makers. So they both looked at the collections, and the specific exhibition that was on display at the time was this French medieval manuscript. And basically one of the makers looked at stitching, cross-stitching, e-textiles, which is looking at textiles and introducing LED lights and combining new technology with old technology, and board games. And she was inspired by the collections of the specific exhibition, and she worked with our teams for 3 days. And then our other maker is, she won the Festival of Curiosity Maker in Residence last year as part of their festival, and she combines the old and the new. So her creative concept is to look at traditional textiles, traditional fashion, and then combining it with new technologies. And she introduced our teams to printing textiles using not a laser printer, I've forgotten the term, but it'll come to me in a second. And so these are two local makers, and they came in and they engaged our young teens aged 12 to 17. The maker on the right here, Ali Nolan, she is going to France in December as part of the Making Museum Maker in Residence. So we're sending her over for 12 days to work in a textile museum in the northeast of France. We just confirmed it last week. So there again, we're giving a young maker an opportunity to go over and learn from another museum. And then she'll come back in February of next year to the Chester Beatty and work with our teams and work with our facilitators and share her learning experience with us as well. I'm coming to, oh gosh, it's now 20 to 3, which is 20 to 4 European time. What can we learn from these creative collaborations? I think to keep an open dialogue is really, really important, and to be able to work with a maker who may not be familiar with the museum process or the museum structure, but also for a museum professional to understand what it's like working with a maker. Makers don't work 9 to 5 all the time. Makers might work in the evening time. They might have a part-time job, and they may be a little bit shy. They may be a little bit socially awkward, or they might be really, really, confident. It depends. But to be able to work with somebody who may not always be as upfront in communication. I tend to talk a lot. I'm an extrovert. Makers may not be all extroverts. I'll just give you an example. but to be able to keep that communication flow in the build-up towards a collaboration, and being able to use Skype, phone, email, or text. It has to work both ways as well, and to be able to work out and problem solve. If I gave the example of the projector, that 20K ANSI one. I mean, I spent 2 weeks looking for a projector, and it was very, very difficult, but it pulled through in the end. And that's really from knowing people on the ground here in Dublin. That's the way Ireland works. Everybody knows everybody, and somebody in here happened to know somebody in the castle, and the castle were so generous, and we were very, very lucky to get that projector. Creativity is messy. It's not linear, and expect the unexpected, because things change. And I learned that very quickly, and Chris learned that very quickly, for example. The other makers, there are waves and troughs. So to be able to be flexible and work with plans, because they can change all the time, or they might just, it just depends on the context. And don't lose heart, because if something changes, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's supposed to change, but to be able to explore different avenues. And that's where the creative process is really important, because the maker may have an alternative. And that's what makers do. They're thinking and problem solving all the time. And that's through design thinking now. Design thinking, you can check that online. I'm sure most of you are using design thinking. It's something new to me, so much so that I introduced visual thinking, which is an element of design thinking, with students last week for the very first time in a facilitated tour of a collection, of an exhibition here. And I would say that creative collaborations, see them as an adventure. They're a huge learning process. I have learned so much over the last 3 years, and I'm still learning. And I am really, really adamant that it's important to continue these creative collaborations. They might seem a little bit scary and awkward and weird and unusual at the beginning, but so long as you've got those elements, that communication, that open communication, to be able to work with change, and to change when it comes up, it's a huge and enriching learning process. And I suppose the most important thing is mutual trust and understanding. Very, very important throughout. And this isn't about, well, this is my territory, and when you come into my territory, you've got to follow these rules. It's being able to adjust and to being able to adapt, and also to step outside your comfort zone. I mentioned that the science hackathon. I stepped outside my comfort zone when I did the science hackathon. I had no idea what I was doing. I was working with people called coders, people who, create those computer programs. I still don't understand what they are, but I worked with people who speak a different language. And, it's being able to meet people halfway and to be able to share. And, I suppose as a communicator, I'm able to reinterpret what a maker might say, and vice versa, and the other way around. And then, that's just to say, that's me in a nutshell. But we hope to have another maker in 2019 from the San Jose twinning. We were so enthusiastic about our last experience with Corinne Okada-Takara in 2017 that we said we would love to have another maker from the United States, if possible, through the San Jose twinning. So there are opportunities out there. It's just, I suppose, we're just open to it. And that's, and one more thing, if you are looking for tools to learn or to explore how to work with makers, the Creative Museum Project has a very good toolkit. And it comes in 3 parts, and it's looking at extending to communities, creating a space for yes, which is basically opening up your museum space to create these opportunities to work with makers, and strategies for success, these things that do work. They're all available on the Creative Museum Project's website, and they're free to download. So I do encourage you, if you can, to download them and take a look at them. So if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer. Anyone have any questions? Fabienne? Do you know if anyone's got any questions? Oh, what is the most challenging part of reaching the right audience today? How do you get people to answer an open call? Okay, Fabienne. Deborah Scagion, I hope I pronounced that right. What is the most challenging part of reaching the right audience? It depends on the right audience. What do you mean by a right audience? I think audience in general, you'd be very surprised at what you term as right audience. You're going to get some really interesting people coming through your door, and I'd be a little bit hesitant to call it right audience. It's audiences, and there's not just one audience. You've got all age groups, you've got all walks of life, you've got people of different backgrounds, of different ages, of different interests. It's really, I suppose, you've got to start off somewhere, and that's what I'm saying. Most the kind of general traditional offer tends to be guided tours, workshops for children, teens, and adults, films, music, and they're fine. They all serve a very particular purpose, and there's nothing wrong with them whatsoever. It's then extending that reach beyond the traditional offer that museums give. Do you want to stay in your comfort zone? Do you want to still continue offering the same thing to the same audience? Or do you want to start exploring how best to reach the hard to reach audiences? And the maker community, I think, are just one particular audience, and they make up so many people who have so much to contribute and so much to share. And they themselves make up other elements of audiences. They could be teachers, lecturers, they could be unemployed, they could be people with disabilities. You just don't know. So it really depends on what your remit is within your context for your museum. But for us, we were stuck. We had been hit by a really tough recession. Our budgets had been cut, but we were still being expected to offer the same offer during the boom time here, during the economic miracle, I should say, the Celtic Tiger, on very little money. And that's where we decided, well, we've got to think differently. We've got to think laterally, and how do we extend this to our audiences, but with very little money. And how do you get people to answer an open call? We, again, through our networks, through our maker community, we got people to answer the open call, and Twitter, Facebook, email, phone, chatting to people. Eleonora Rampicini, have these works been documented? Yes. If you look at the Creative Museum project website, I wonder, can I get the link? We have different case studies. Creative, okay. I'm going to cut and paste it. Can I do that? Or will I put it into the dialog box? If I can put it into the oh, no. It doesn't like that, but I'll read it out to you. It's creative-museum.net, and check that out, because a lot of the works have been documented on that specific website. If you look at, for example, the Chester Beatty website, you'll find there will be a number of videos that I commissioned through the Creative and Making Museum. And then if you look at the different partners of this particular project, you'll find their own specific responses to the Creative Museum and Making Museum.